Okay, so in today's lesson we're going to be looking at Islamic definitions of gender. We're going to be looking at what gender means within Islam, as well as like the kind of practices and expectations of gender throughout Islamic countries and over time how it's been influenced. So the basic level of Islam views men and women as equal, as the Quran gives both male and female believers the same religious duties. The Quran states that women and men will be judged equally according to the same criteria. It is also interesting to note that at the time of Islam's creation, Muhammad improved the position and status of women from the pre-Islamic world of primitive religions in 7th century Arabia. It was seen to have very progressive teachings on the matter of women and their status in society. Within the Arab Peninsula, women were seen to be possessions of their fathers and then their husbands. Islamic law made it sacred for girls to be educated and gave women rights to ownership and inheritance, challenging previous preconceptions of women's status and their role in society. Muhammad also decreed that sexual satisfaction was a woman's entitlement. However, even during its creation and radical changes Islam made to women's statuses in the 6th century, Muhammad also enshrined women's inequality in immutable law. So examples of this are as follows. Women's testimony in court is worth half of a man's. Compensation for the murder of a woman is half for a man in Sharia. Women can only have one husband while men are allowed up to 4 wives. The legal age for girls to marry is very young, which is based on Muhammad's marriage of his second wife, who was at the time of marriage was only 9 at the time of marriage, and I just want to make note that it was common for men to marry women young at this time. So there's lots of talk about how Muhammad was seen to be a pedophile, but this is just inaccurate, as many men married women at a very young age at this time. And so as lots of Muslims look to Muhammad as the kind of perfect example of what a Muslim should be, this has kind of made it okay for Islamic nations today to make marriage for girls younger. So many Islamic countries continue this practice. So as we know through Afghanistan, as we've seen, as well as in Iran, marriage for girls is 9, where it's 14 for boys. And as we know, even when these laws are challenged and changed, like in Afghanistan, they're not always enforced. So wives face difficulties in suing for divorce, though husbands can usually get a divorce very easily. And domestic violence is common and justified, and I put justified in quotation marks by a verse in the Quran, as that is highly contested. Some say that it is, and others really argue that it's not. So it's kind of down to interpretation. So gender, especially women's roles and status within Islam, are not clear-cut. It is clear religiously women and men are held equal. They have also been afforded some equal social rights, with, for example, education, property and ownership and divorce. However, as with any religion, it does not exist in a vacuum, and as such, culture and its interpretation of Islam have had a significant impact on the extent to which the equality of gender is allowed and established. So culturally, many Islamic countries still hold sacred the ideal of patriarchal society, in which women have very limited and defined roles and rights, which are sometimes in direct contradiction to the Quran and the Hadiths. Therefore, as I've said, the cultural interpretations of Islamic scripture in regards to gender are skewed to some extent. This is the case as there is often a gap between between what the Quran teaches and what mullahs interpret. So, for example, this can be seen in honour killings in quite a few Islamic nations, as they occur every year in the Islamic countries, and the perpetrators are punished leniently, if at all. Other examples of this can be seen through female genital mutilation, or FGM, which continues to be widespread in sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt. So the World Health Organization estimates that 140 million girls and women have suffered this practice, which directly challenges Muhammad's support of female sexual satisfaction. Another example is the practice of purdah, which is the seclusion of women from men, which is still heavily practiced and encouraged in many Islamic countries, which plays a significant role in limiting women's participation in the meso world, particularly in education and work. These cultural practices are not mandated by Islam, and I really want to stress that, and that's why this is in bold. They're not mandated by Islam and predate Muhammad and are based in tribal culture. However, as we know, Islam is a product of its historical context, so sexual anxiety lies at the core of many Islamic scriptures regarding women. So whilst Islam talks about equality between the sexes, there's still a lot of script texts, and not necessarily in the Quran, but in other texts, that kind of focus on not so controlling women's sexual expression and sexual desires. As with any religion and any culture at the time, there was really about trying to control their desires and concerns over, who they'd become if they kind of went off and had sex outside of marriage. So because this kind of the contradictions between what the religion says for a lot of Muslims and how it's played out or how it's practiced in a lot of these Islamic countries, women have become the forefront of agents of change for this, like where we saw in Afghanistan with Rawa as using, and a lot of the time they use the script to challenge what the government says or what men are saying about how women should be living. So there are clearly growing segments of Islamic feminists who argue that Islam has been hijacked by cultural patriarchy, as I see the rights being denied to women as complete contradictions to Islamic scripture, as true Islam honours the right of women, and we're going to see this in the video that you're going to watch in a second. They act as agents of change and argue against FGM, rights to education and family, and reform in some areas of Islam, especially in regards to how Sharia is implemented in some of these countries. However, we also should look at men in Islam. When we speak of gender, we often look at women as having roles because this is where we tend to see a lot of restrictions and control. However, men in Islam also have clear roles and expectation, as told in the Quran and the Hadith and Sunnah. Men are also expected to dress modestly. In many more traditional Islamic societies, men are also expected to wear loose, long-fitting clothes, like in Saudi Arabia, men wear the thobe, which is a white garment that goes all the way to their ankles, and are expected to also cover their hair. And as we watch in the video in a second, we're going to see some of the more conservative nations where men are expected to also dress conservatively. And as we look at some of these countries where women are covered, you'll also notice that men tend to cover themselves as well, maybe not as in traditional clothes like the burqa or the niqab in some of the countries that women have to wear, but you won't see men walking around in shorts and short sleeve shirts. So there are still clear restrictions on what men should wear. Again, this is a cultural interpretation of males' modest dress. However, it is important to note that men are not as harshly punished as women, as we'll come to see, if they do not wear the thobe in public. Men are expected to look after their wives and family. This is in regards to work. Within the scriptures, Islam teaches that a man's earning is for his wife and family. He must look after them. However, a woman's earning is for herself. So at least in the text, men have a lot more restrictions over their money and what they can do with it. They're allowed to have up to 4 wives, but only if they can care for all of them equally, both financially and emotionally. And if they can't do that, then they're not allowed to have another wife. And men, as I've already said, are seen as the same as women, as previously mentioned. They're expected to live a religiously devout life that honours the teachings of Muhammad and Allah. And so they should be doing all of the religious practices and expectations, as should women do as well. Okay, so now you're going to watch a video that looks at gender in quite a few different Islamic nations and what is happening and how women especially are trying to challenge some of the examples that I've given you, so some of the Islamic nations' interpretations of gender and how they're turning to the scripts to help them to do that. You'll find this video on Edpuzzle, so you must go there, and it's called I think it's Unveiling Islam. So you'll find it in Edpuzzle.